Your TAM just isn't big enough. That might be the #1 reason why VCs pass on startups. And market sizing isn't just some academic exercise to appease investors. If you're going to spend the next 15 years of your life building a startup, you're going to want to convince yourself that the market is big and attractive enough to deserve your time. So that's why it's so important to understand your TAM. In this video, I'm going to explain the #1 thing you might be missing in estimating your TAM, and then I'm going to explain why even VCs who think about this all day long often get it wrong, and spectacularly wrong. Let's get started. First off, you may have heard of SAM, SOM, and other terms related to TAM. I just forget about those. I think if you do a good job defining your TAM, that's really all you need. So what is TAM exactly? The simplest definition that most people use is it's the number of potential customers multiplied by how much they pay you. That's basically your revenue potential at the end of the day. Just ignore all those McKinsey and Wall Street industry research reports. Those top-down market estimates are kind of worthless to your actual TAM. If you're creating a new premium fashion marketplace, for example, you're not selling it at the global $880 billion apparel market. You may be targeting just the high end of that market in the US, which is $20 billion, and of that, specifically the online portion of the spend, which is more like $1 billion. And not only that, but your real revenue in a marketplace model could be just a percentage take of the transactions through your platform, say 10%. So your actual net revenue potential may look more like $100 million. So it's important to be very precise about that. If you're starting a financing company that offers startups upfront loans based on the expected revenue from customer contracts, you're not actually going after the $7 trillion in global lending. Maybe it's a solution that actually just fits companies that are pre-Series B and the Series C stage before companies hire CFOs. That could cut your potential customers down to just several thousands. And maybe that solution is actually tailored for hardware companies that have big upfront capital expenditure costs. And maybe the go-to-market just doesn't make sense where there's not a mature startup ecosystem the team can access. So really it's just good for the US and Canada for now, and so on. That's how you actually pare down the number of potential addressable customers. And then you have to look at what's your actual revenue per customer. Well, if you look at pricing, venture debt alternatives price at say 5% per annum, and alternative lenders price at maybe 15% per year. So maybe the market will only bear something in the middle of that. And maybe your customers are only taking advantage of your loans for a small subset of their contracts. And maybe they're only doing it during Q3 and Q4 when they need a stretch to make their year-end budgeting work. And there may be market pricing pressure that forces that number down even further over time. So now you can take the actual revenue per customer and multiply that by the number of customers to get a realistic TAM. So that's the conventional framework for calculating TAM, and I think it's a useful place to start. But that said, the real question an investor and you as a founder are trying to answer is just very simply, how valuable can your business be? And that's actually different than just calculating revenue potential, because not all revenue is created equal. This is very frequently not captured in TAM analysis, and a lot of YouTube videos I think even miss this, so I wanted to highlight it. One easy way to define the enterprise value of a company is by taking the revenue potential and multiplying it by the revenue multiple for a specific industry or business model. For a SaaS company, that's about 15 times revenue today in the public markets. So if you're going after a $1 billion revenue potential market, then if you can own 10% of that market, you can see your way to $100 million in annual recurring revenue, and that maps to a roughly $1.5 billion business. But if you're a consumer subscription business, typical revenues are more like 3 to 5 times. So that means if you have a $1 billion revenue potential market there and you capture 10% of that and become a $100 million revenue business, you'll only be valued at 3 to 500 million. That's a pretty big difference, and most VCs are going to be looking for companies that can be valued at $1 billion or more to make it worth the investment. So it's important to think more holistically beyond just revenue potential to understand what are the strategic multiples of your company. If you're pitching your startup, that can mean highlighting strategic acquisitions in the past made at premium multiples, or highlighting very large, motivated, and competitive buyers of your company who hopefully themselves are trading at premium multiples. Now, all that said, founders and VCs routinely underestimate the size of software markets. When David Z invested in Facebook at a $500 million valuation, he famously pounded the table for an investment case of 3 to 5x upside, arguing the company could be worth 1.5 to 3 billion or so. He was off, luckily for him, by about 1,000x, 3 orders of magnitude. This happens over and over, where professional VCs who assess thousands of companies get it wrong all the time. Why is that? Well, in my opinion, there's 5 key reasons. Number 1 is adjacencies. A lot of companies find ways to layer more and more product features and revenue streams over time. If you recall the framework we used, the conventional way to think of TAM is the number of potential customers times the price. Well, you can't charge very much for narrow features, so your TAM is naturally going to look really bad in that case. But if your initial offering is strategic enough for your customers, often that earns you a seat at the table to stretch into other products you can charge more for. Customers don't want to work with 100 different point solution vendors to solve all their problems. They'd rather have a single pane of glass to work with. Corporate card companies like Brex, Ramp, or Carrot are great examples of this. They offer companies a way to issue credit cards to employees for corporate expenses. They then make money off interchange, which is about 1 to 2% of spend. So in of itself, that might not sound like a lot, and it may take massive scale of spend to make money. But because these cards are used so frequently, and because companies like Brex have spending data, it's natural to start layering in expense management tools and business banking on top of that. And pretty soon, you're acting like a bank. And now every customer is no longer worth just a few $1,000s to you. They're worth tens or potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars. The most obvious example of adjacencies in action is just by looking at Facebook or Google, who at this point manage dozens, if not hundreds of products. Facebook leaned on social graph data to build identity features, for example, while Google leaned on its search data to offer Google Trends. The second way people missize TAM is by underestimating the compounding effects of growth. What's a small market today could be a huge market in just 5 or 10 years. If you sold tools to YouTubers and TikTokers, 5 to 10 years ago, there'd only be a few thousand full-time professionals. Today, there's more than 200,000 channels on YouTube with more than 100,000 subs. And that number is growing 60% per year. If you multiply that out, in another 5 years, there'll be 1 million channels that reach that mark. As Wayne Gretzky famously said, you have to skate to where the puck is going to be. By the time you actually build out a product, that could be 12 months later. Then you might work through development with early customers for another year, and then start to scale go-to-market the year after that. So that could be 3 years later, and by then, the market may very well have matured and caught up to you. And in some rare cases, companies can actually expand the size of the market by making it much more accessible and affordable. For example, a lot of people assumed Uber was playing in the $100 billion taxi market. But when Uber entered a market, it cut fare prices in half, it made pickup times predictable, and improved coverage areas for riders. So a lot more people started riding Ubers than taxis. And people were even giving up car ownership in favor of being driven around by Ubers. Car ownership is a $750 billion market and much bigger than just taxis. So what you could have assumed was a potential TAM in the tens of billions became worth hundreds of billions. This effect has tripped up some very smart people, like this professor who famously wrote Uber could never be worth more than 17 billion. Founders often say, here's how big our company could be if we captured just 1 or 10% of the market. Sometimes that number is unrealistically high, and sometimes that number is actually way too low. In some markets, especially fragmented ones that lend themselves well to marketplace models, there may be winner-take-all dynamics where the leader can command 80% of the market or more. And so when you can grow the size of the market by 10 times and then own all of it, the conventional math of 10% of an existing market is off by a lot. So in that sense, in some ways, it's more important to pay attention to the market structure rather than just the size. Is it fragmented, underserved, or inefficient? If you have one takeaway from this video, it's this: size isn't everything. The market structure is potentially even more important. Lastly, it's actually just really hard sometimes to assess new market creation. Let's say you're selling into chief diversity officers, a completely new role within corporations. They control some portion of budget, but it's brand new and it's unclear what it's going to be and how it's going to be allocated. Or let's say you're starting the next TikTok or Snap. How effectively can you monetize your users through a completely new media format and consumer behavior? You can try to make assumptions around how much eyeballs are worth through classic advertising benchmarks like CPMs, but every medium monetizes differently, and it's hard to say for sure before you actually do it. And finally, you can't discount luck. There's so many potential externalities that can transform markets that it's just not humanly possible to anticipate everything that could happen. We invested in Ro, a phenomenal direct-to-consumer digital health and telemedicine business, and they would have done fine in any scenario, but no one would have predicted a global pandemic would increase telemedicine usage by 100x almost overnight, pulling forward regulation and consumer behavior by about a decade. When you add up all these reasons, that's why even professional VCs often get TAM and market sizing wrong by a lot. But if you're a founder and a deep domain expert in a field, you may have a unique insight on where the market is going and how it may unfold, such that you alone may understand the true scope of the opportunity. And you, unlike VCs, may already have the mental chessboard mapped out in your mind of what moves you can make several years in the future to get to world domination. Then you might be able to successfully navigate the common pitfalls I've shared and build the future Facebook or Google, which the rest of the world is overlooking today. Good luck, and I'll see you next week.